mean, a week from tomorrow is the last day of classes, which is scary to think about. Yeah, we're really getting to the end of it. Oh my goodness. I need to get my act in gear, I think, and really grind through the last couple weeks here. But I'm sure probably a lot of people can relate to that. Alrighty, so the goal for tonight is to get through lecture 24, which was like kind of 2 lectures on signaling and defense, and lecture 25, which was on communities. So, kicking things off, what are pathogens and parasites, and just in general, how does the immune system protect an organism? So, pathogens is a very general term. It's pretty much just any organisms that cause disease is a pathogen. Or even, you could even argue the term organisms there, because, you know, a pathogen could be a bacteria, could be a virus. That's why I say you could argue organism. I wouldn't really use that term to describe a virus. Could be a parasite. A parasite's a type of pathogen. Could be a fungus. I don't know, lots of options. So it's a very, very general term. I think sometimes parasite can be not so much like a difficult concept in general, but that it sort of just gets lumped in as meaning the same as a pathogen sometimes, which it doesn't. A parasite is a type of pathogen, specifically organisms that feed on a host and benefit at the host's expense. Yeah, so they're a type of pathogen, but they're not interchangeable. Sort of like, if this makes you more confused, just ignore me because it's sort of a bad analogy. But not really. Sort of like how a square is a type of rectangle, but okay, never mind. Oh my goodness. A square is a type of rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Again, if that made you more confused, then just ignore me. Okay, yeah. And so the immune system is absolutely wild, actually. If you want to dive deeper into it, I'm currently taking an immunology course with Dr. Mike Duffy. He's a good guy. And it is vast. It's insane. It blows my mind, like on a daily basis. Just how specific and precise our immune systems are. So yeah, like I said, there's a whole course here at UMB on the immune system. We briefly kind of glanced over it in this one bit of a lecture, right? So I wouldn't worry about knowing, like obsessing over it and knowing all the details, but it's good just to have like a general idea of things. So the main sort of concept behind any immune system is that it distinguishes self from non-self. So that's kind of like the key sort of catchphrase when it comes to immunology, distinguishing self from non-self. Sort of like, the key sort of catchphrase with protein synthesis is like DNA to RNA to protein. With the immune system, distinguishing self from non-self. So essentially, we have certain autoimmune diseases that lead to the immune system no longer has the ability to sort of, well, okay, let me back up. So, non-self would be like a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, that sort of thing, a parasite. So a pathogen of some sort is non-self. And basically the immune system, it's used to seeing, bits of self throughout our body. That's normal. We're supposed to be in our own body, right? And they don't raise the alarm over that. They're like, okay, these particles are normal. But they have to be able to sort of recognize when there are non-self particles, like a bacteria. to an extent, right? Because, we have bacteria in us that are, very good for our health. They're supposed to be there. But, some a pathogen specifically. So bacteria that is going to cause disease. And there are two main branches of the immune system. So there's the innate response, which all organisms have, aside from like very, very simple animals, for example, like sponges. But you can think of the innate response as being, something quite universal. And so the innate response is really quick, and it's not very specific. So it's things like inflammation, maybe you start to get sick, you get a sore throat. Well, your sore throat, might be due to swelling in your throat, which is inflammation, which is the body's response. So maybe you've contracted, I don't know, just like a rhinovirus. But maybe it's a strep throat infection, right? Either way, one of the body's first responses is inflammation. And so your throat's gonna swell a bit and you're gonna get that sore throat. So yeah, the innate response isn't super specific. So whether the pathogen is virus, a parasite, that sort of thing, the responses that are part of the innate system are going to be pretty similar. Also things like, a fever. Also just your barriers are part of the innate system. So like skin as a barrier, mucus as a barrier, that sort of thing. That's all part of the innate system. And so the adaptive response is sort of the other half of things. And this is in vertebrates only. So we have an adaptive response. And this response is typically slower. Typically can take, like around 10 days to kick in upon initial infection anyway. And it's also highly specific. So, I mean, it's super relevant right now, right? With like COVID-19, for example. No better time to be taking an immunology course, really, because we talk about it in everyday life. It's on the news all the time. So essentially, thinking in terms of the vaccine, for example, we get the vaccine, we have the spike protein, and our body builds antibodies against that specific spike protein. And so that's an adaptive response. It's slow, takes a while, but it's very, very specific to that spike protein on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19. And the idea behind it is that, it is a very slow process, but if that happens once, then the slow process happens. We might feel like a little bit sick for, a few days afterwards. But we make those antibodies that are specific to the spike protein on SARS-CoV-2. And then the next time we're exposed to the virus, it's not going to take so long, right? It's going to be a quicker transition because we don't have to sort of remake the antibodies. Our body's already familiar with that specific spike protein and we're good to go, essentially. Okay, I probably got a little bit too far into that just because it's just so relevant, I guess. It's cool to I guess know how things work. My dad got the COVID shot this afternoon, his first dose of it. So yeah, really no better time to be talking about the immune system than in a global pandemic. Okay, yeah, so I wouldn't worry probably about knowing a whole lot about the immune system, but just in general, the innate, the adaptive, and distinguishing self from non-self, that's the main thing. Okay, so predatory defenses, pretty straightforward, really. I just sort of wanted to touch on it, so I didn't completely skip over it. So there's a few different categories. Behavioral predatory defenses are things like, animals which live in herds or schools. So for example, well, I mean, there's a million examples, but big herds of wildebeest that migrate, across savanna biomes and that sort of thing. Essentially, if you've ever seen, a nature documentary that has like all these, big wildebeest migrating, they move in massive, massive herds, wild. And that's protective because if you have all these wildebeest and hungry lion comes along, they're only going to take one down. So the more sort of wildebeest you have around you as a wildebeest, the less of a chance that the lion's going to take you down, essentially. Bit morbid, maybe, but. And I guess just the sheer size can be intimidating as well. Kind of like, I love being outside in the woods by myself. No, thank you. With other people, oh yeah, like I wouldn't, if one other person is with me, I'm like completely at ease. By myself, I can do it for a little bit, but then I hear a bird fly off and I think that grizzly bear's coming for me. So yeah, that's one. Another behavioral defense is just like, hiding, fleeing. In some cases, self-defense. So, fight or flight. I'm a flight. Like I just said, I run off when I hear a noise. I was actually hiking, this is a side tangent, I was hiking last summer in the northern part of the province, and I was walking beside this very large bush, and there was a moose I could see way, way ahead of me. And I heard this very loud thrash in the bush right next to me, probably like 3 feet to my left, and gone. I sprinted away. It was not, I was afraid, right, that it was going to be a moose and it was like right next to me and would trample me to death, perhaps. I think it was a coyote. I saw the back of it running off. So it was either a coyote or a big cat of some sort. But anyway, we both chose to flee in that example. Yeah, I don't really know why I got onto that tangent. It's just sort of a fun story. I guess I mentioned fight or flight, and I'm most definitely a flight type of person. And so was the critter in the bush. So yeah, another type of predatory defense is chemical. So things like, toxins or scents. A skunk, for example, that's probably one we're all familiar with. My dog has been sprayed by a skunk a couple of times before, and it's not fun. You would think he would learn his lesson too, right? But he doesn't. But it works for most animals, right? Humans especially, we see a skunk, we know to go the other way. There are also different physical defenses. So, morphological defenses, like those of a porcupine, for example. My dog has not gotten into a porcupine, thank goodness, but my cat has, of all things. It's very odd. The vet had never seen a cat that had a mouth full of porcupine quills before. But I think he really learned his lesson, right? Stay away from the porcupines. Also, a lot of plants use this type of thing, especially, plants that are accustomed to sort of like a really dry environment are typically quite thorny. So that is, a morphological physical defense to sort of keep predators away. Also, things like coloration and mimicry. There are a bunch of examples that we went over in class of the different types of coloration and mimicry. I find them really, really interesting. And I wanted to squeeze them in tonight, but I thought there were probably more important things to really talk about because, they are right there in the slides, but they might not be necessarily super straightforward. But I might go over them, as we slide into exam prep in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, essentially, things like camouflage for one, so blending into your surroundings, mimicking a different organism's coloring that, looks, or mimicking a different organism that is dangerous, so that when another organism looks at you, they'll think that you are also dangerous, that sort of thing. It's pretty interesting, really. It's neat. But anyway, I don't want to take up too much time on that. Okay, altruism. I find this kind of neat as well. It's really not funny, but it sort of is. So essentially, altruism is when animals will protect others, even sort of at the expense of themselves. And does it make evolutionary sense? In some contexts, yes. So yes, altruism makes sense, or I guess makes some evolutionary sense, because fitness is still achieved if their genes get passed along, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to mean that that specific animal has to reproduce. If they have, a sibling that they can protect, and the sibling will go on to reproduce, then, they share genes with that sibling, some of their genes still get passed along. So fitness is still achieved by allowing for close relatives, such as a sibling, to survive and reproduce. And essentially what's used is Hamilton's rule, which looks like this. So when RB is greater than C, which I'll go over in a moment. So that's Hamilton's rule. So little r is the relatedness of the two individuals. B is the benefit, and C is the cost. So if the relationship between the organisms is close enough, if the benefit is great enough, if the if the benefit and the strength of the relationship are greater than the cost, then it makes evolutionary sense for one organism to sacrifice themselves. So there's, drastic examples. Should boy save brother from the shark? That sort of thing. Which, yes, that is obviously applicable to Hamilton's rule as well. It's just sort of a bit drastic, running into a burning building and all that dramatic stuff. But sort of like a less do or die sort of situation with Hamilton's rule would be like, let's say there were two female lions, they're sisters. And they both have what's the word here? A litter of kittens? A pack of kittens? I don't know. They both have, I think it's a litter of baby lions at the same time. And so one sister is thriving. Her baby lions are doing great. The other one is unable to produce milk for some reason. Her baby lions all die off. She's got one left, but it's not doing too great, and it's gonna die if it doesn't get milk somehow. So essentially, the relatedness in this scenario, the relatedness of siblings is 0.5, and that's the closest you can get with a full sibling, I guess. Half siblings are a different story. They might be 0.25, that would make sense. But yeah, 0.5 is the closest you can get, except for in the case of identical twins. Those have a relationship of, or like a relatedness, of 1, which is wild because they share the exact same genes. Yeah, but siblings are a relatedness of 0.5. You wouldn't be expected to memorize all the relatedness values. I think I don't even know. I don't even know off the top of my head. So you wouldn't have to remember all of them. But yeah, sibling is 0.5. That's the only one I know off the top of my head. And let's say the benefit in this situation is, well, if the milk producing lion takes over the baby lion cub and starts feeding it, the benefit is one whole cub survives. The cost would be that maybe, since this lion is now producing or not, it probably wouldn't produce more milk, right? So they're producing the same amount of milk, but now they have an extra mouth to feed. And so maybe one of their babies, health starts to deteriorate a little bit, but it doesn't die. Let's just say it gets a little bit ill. So maybe the cost is like, I don't know. It's hard for me to just pull a number in a thin air and be like, oh yes, the cost is 0.25, but that's what I'm going to say. Yeah, because it's not like a cost of one, you lose a whole baby. Let's say one baby is like 3/4 of the health it could have been if its mom wouldn't have taken in the other line, if that makes sense. So essentially in that scenario, we'd have 0.5 as our relatedness. And I know I don't have like the scenario written out here. Maybe I should have done that. The benefit was one whole baby lion. The cost was 0.25 because one of the original mom's babies got a little bit sick. It's not as strong as it could have been, but it's like still 75% healthy, right? It's not going to die. So in this case, 0.5 times 1 is 0.5, obviously. So the risk or the benefit outweighs the cost. So it would make evolutionary sense for the mother to take in its sister's cub. That's the word that I was looking for when I was saying lion baby so many times. Lion cub, I think. Anyway. Okay, yeah, so that's an example of Hamilton's rule. There's also, there's so many examples you could go over, but they're a bit more drastic. And it's not like, if you have a cheetah. I don't know why I'm going with cheetahs now, but I'll say you have a cheetah and it's not gonna, like whip out its calculator and use Hamilton's rule to decide if it should, save its brother. So it's not like a solid rule. It's sort of more of like a general rule of thumb that it would make, evolutionary sense if they were to sacrifice themselves, if the benefits outweighing the cost. Okay, so that's defense. Moving into signaling. What is the function of signaling? Just super generally, signals regulate everything pretty much. Regulate growth, growth development, reproduction, energy, metabolism, behavior, pretty much everything in the body is regulated to some extent by a signal. Like my brain is sending a signal for me to raise my hand right now. Which kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies when I really think about it. Like, it's so wild how we work. But anyway, let's not get into that. That's a whole other can of worms. Okay, yeah, so the function of signaling is to regulate all these different bodily functions, essentially. And what steps does this process typically follow? Again, quite generally, reception. So a signal is received, like my brain sends a signal to my muscles to raise my hand. Transduction. The signal is sort of transduced, so my arm's like, okay, we're gearing up to get ready to be raised, and then response. Hand is raised. That's maybe like a poor example. We did talk about this quite a bit more in depth with Dr. Durnford if you took Bio 1001 just in the fall. If you took it a bit like longer ago than that, that might be a little bit slippery for you. Certainly is for me. Cell signaling is wild. Similar to immunology, Dr. Durnford teaches a whole course on cell signaling. I was in it for 2 days and then I dropped it. I would like to take it at some point. I just had too much going on. And that seemed like the one to drop. But it's like just a super complex process, right? It's incredible. So to sort of simplify it into these 3 steps is a big oversimplification, but it's essentially, how it works. It's a generalization for sure, but it's for the most part, that's the 3 steps that we see. Okay, next, hormones versus phytohormones. What's what here? Hormones are chemicals in animals specifically that regulate development. And they're synthesized specifically in endocrine glands. And so they're synthesized in endocrine glands. They then get secreted to extracellular fluid and then are transported throughout, oh my goodness. There we go. Transported through the circulatory system is what I was trying to get at. So again, this was a common theme this evening. Dr. Charles Jacoby teaches a whole course on vertebrate endocrinology. So, like, it's a lot, right? To sort of just shove into one sentence of a cow session, I guess. Yeah, it's a huge process. But essentially, you know, these hormones are synthesized in our endocrine glands. They flow through our bloodstream, and they regulate development. That's all you really probably want to know. Phytohormones, on the other hand, are essentially just plant hormones. So they are chemicals in plants that regulate development. Just to sort of like give a comparison between the two, I should have had this. Oh well. Oops. Hormones in plants versus hormones in animals. You can make a few comparisons. So in general, the number of hormones in plants is pretty few, whereas in animals there are a lot. We have a ton of different hormones that do very specific functions as animals. Plants, on the other hand, have quite a few less. They sort of just have like their main guns and they're sticking with it. They're just going to use a few that are really good at doing lots of things. So that's the concept of specificity. So plant specificity is really low, whereas animal hormone specificity is high. So plants, they don't have a lot of hormones, right? So the few hormones that they have to be sort of able to generalize. So, you know, they can't say, okay, we have one specific hormone that does this one specific job. We have another hormone that does this specific job. We have another hormone that does this specific job. Instead, they'll have one hormone that can do a bunch of jobs, another hormone that can do a bunch of other jobs. Whereas in animals, we're more like, okay, yes, we have one hormone allocated for this specific role, and that's it. So that also sort of relates to cooperativity. Plant hormones typically have high cooperativity. There's so few of them, but they sort of have to, you know, work in unison in some scenarios. Whereas animal hormones have low cooperativity because, like I said, generally it's sort of, you know, one, oh, that was ineffective. One, why can't I get rid of this? Okay, it doesn't matter. One hormone, will sort of undergo one specific role, and so they don't really need to work together because they're just good at doing their own thing, essentially. Oh, and I should mention that in plants, phytohormones are sort of just synthesized throughout the plant, so not really localized to a certain region. There we go. So some examples of signals that organisms receive from the environment. So many. There are probably like infinite answers to this. Pressure signals, gravity, that's a big one. It's constantly working on, anything on the planet. Sound, temperature, different chemicals, electromagnetic radiation, which is fun. Like essentially, there's no real limit to the different signals that we receive from the environment. So for example, if the temperature drops, we receive a signal that's like, hey, it's cold out now, like maybe let's get some goosebumps going. Maybe let's, start some muscle contraction, some shivering. There's just so many good examples. Gravity in plants, for example, might end up signaling to a plant that it's sort of better to grow short and wide as opposed to long and tall, just if, gravity is too strong of a force acting on the plant, that sort of thing. And then electromagnetic radiation, I wanted to dabble on that because I think anyway, typically, that's sort of a point of confusion. I remember being scared of this when I was in this course myself. And I don't know why in retrospect. It's not, it's sort of just a concept. It's not something you need to understand every small detail about. Last year, I sort of, everything got very chaotic last year, this time of year. So I couldn't get a good gauge on how people felt about these phytochrome receptors last year when I was doing PAL, but yeah, I know for me I was like scared. But anyway, it's not that confusing or bad or scary. Basically, these phytochromes are photoreceptors, and so they recept light. They receive light. Photoreceptor, if you sort of break it down. So this is related to electromagnetic radiation signals. If you think of the electromagnetic spectrum, and you think of specifically the visible spectrum, we have red light, orange light, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, all the colors of the rainbow. And then like extending, further on, we have to either side, there's like, gamma rays, X-rays. On the other end, it's like, microwaves, that sort of thing. But what we're sort of more concerned with is the visible spectrum. And so these phytochromes are a photoreceptor, typically in plants. Well, yeah, I don't know why I said typically in plants, they're in plants. There's no typically about it. And basically they're the same photoreceptor, but they sort of have these two different conformations. And so this one is referred to as phytochrome red. And phytochrome red absorbs red light. So when the sun shines down on the plant, it takes whatever red light is coming through, which we know all light is like made up of all the different colors of the visible spectrum. I'm not a physicist. It's been a while since I've really gotten into the electromagnetic spectrum. But anyway, there's bits of red light in the sunlight that shines down. And so the phytochrome red receptor will absorb that red light, and it changes into this conformation, which is called phytochrome far red. And so when the photoreceptor is in this far red conformation, it'll do things like seed germination, start to initiate flowering, that sort of thing. Well, I guess it says that right here. And when essentially the sun goes down, there's a slow conversion overnight back from this far red conformation to the red conformation. So I wouldn't really worry too much about like, oh, how does it do that exactly? Why does it do that exactly? I would more be focused on, phytochrome red absorbs red light from sunlight that transforms to its phytochrome far red conformation, can do things like germinate seeds, start to flower, and then when the sun goes down, it converts back to phytochrome red overnight, which makes sense because these processes, seed germination, flowering, that sort of thing, are processes that, require energy, right? Much more energy than just sort of being stagnant. So it would make sense for these processes to occur in the daytime, in the sunlight, when, you can be working the light reactions of photosynthesis, doing sort of the dirty work. And then in the darkness, you're not going to have access to sunlight to, make as much energy. So you're not going to want to sort of do these complex processes overnight when the sun is not out. That's what I would want to know about those. Don't get all bogged down. It is scary. It's like, what the heck? Like, what does this mean? Unless maybe you're like really into physics. I don't know. I was super into physics. Well, not super, but I was pretty into physics like when I first took this class. And I still was like, that's an immediate no from me. I just get scared when the electromagnetic spectrum's involved. But it's really not that bad. But if there are any sort of lingering questions, feel free to let me know. Okay, next, moving into sort of the communication, or not communications, oh my goodness, the community sort of section, lecture. I sort of have some practice problems going on for some of the calculations that we went through. It's good to know also, what is a community, what is a population, that sort of thing. But I thought in the sake of time, it'd probably be better to go through this type of question than, something that's sort of, you're not going to get asked on an open book test, right? What is a population? Well, you might, I don't know. But it's more likely you'll be asked something like this. And all of these questions are related to moose because I love moose. And when I was making this sheet, I was sort of having a rough day. And I was like, I'm going to make this all about moose. Cheer me up a little bit. It's good fun to talk about things that you love. So I love moose as a true New Brunswicker. So in a population of 100 moose, there are 16 deaths and 24 births in a year. How has the population changed over time? So this is pretty straightforward. The only thing I would want to sort of look out for with this is that it is likely, if it's on a test, you might be given too much information, which can make it tricky because you might, see this, oh, there's 100 moose, and you might feel, okay, I have to do something with that number, that 100, but you really don't. It's just asking, how has the population changed over time given, this number of births and this number of deaths? So ideally, I would have delta n over delta t, but, well, I could insert the little delta symbol, couldn't I? Yeah, I could do that. Make it a little bit more proper. There we go. So the change in population over time is essentially just the number of births, subtract the number of deaths. So there were 24 births, there were 16 deaths in this year. So that leaves us with a sort of, total of positive 8. So over the time period given, the population has increased by 8. So that's all you would have to do for this type of question. It's pretty straightforward. Do I think this would necessarily be the type of question asked? Maybe not, because it, is pretty straightforward. You'd be more likely to get a sort of more complicated one, I think. But you never know. It's good to have the basics down. Okay, also to note, all of this data is made up, so don't come for me. Although the 29,000 moose in the province, I think that's pretty accurate. Just off the top of my head. It's not really off the top of my head because I've looked it up before, but for unrelated reasons. I think we're somewhere right around just under 30,000, so around 29,000. But anyway, let's say we have this year-long research study where we tag 1,000 moose and we check in on them periodically, which is a thing because, you know, moose populations are, you know, dealing with a lot lately, specifically with ticks in the winter. People are mildly concerned about that. I'm concerned about it because I have a soft spot for them. But actual, you know, DNR biologists are concerned about them too. It's not just me. So yeah, let's say we, you know, radio collar 1,000 moose, we track them for a year. And within this selected group of 1,000 moose, we see 253 births and 267 deaths over the year. In the previous year, there were 29,000 moose in the province. Approximately how many moose will be in NB this year? So this one is a little bit less straightforward because it's asking sort of to take this small population and apply it to the rest of the population. So if you just took, you know, 253 births, subtract 267 deaths, what's that give us off the top of my head? I should have written that somewhere. Negative 14, so we lost 14 moose. So there were 29,000, we're gonna lose 14. So there's gonna be 28,900 and, oh my goodness, 986. That's not right. It's not that simple. But it's not much more complicated than that, to be honest. So. Basically, the thing with this is that your numbers are going to be on a per capita basis. So per 1,000 moose, we saw this many births and this many deaths, and so that's a different variable, and that's going to be little r. And little r equals little b subtract little d. And so little b and little d are, unlike the big ones, they're on a per capita basis. So 253 births out of 1,000 moose, it's going to be 0.253. 267 deaths out of 1,000 moose is going to be 0.267. Whoopsies. And so that is going to give us negative 0.14. So you could say there's like a negative 14%, or gotta watch the double negative. There's a 14% decrease in the moose population in this group. And let's just assume that we can take this data and extrapolate it to the whole population. You know, maybe we had bad moose picked. Maybe we had moose that were sickly or whatnot. I don't know. But assuming that the group that we had was, you know, the average moose population of the province, we can extrapolate the data. Jeez. Oh my goodness, there we go. The change in the population over time using this small r, it's r times n, the population. So we had negative 0.14 times 29,000 is our population, and there's a 14% decrease. And so that is going to, whoops, I meant to put an equal sign in there, give us a number of, well, I guess negative 4,060. And so that is how the population has changed over the given time period. So over the time period of a year, we can expect to lose this many moose. So approximately how many moose will be in NB this year? Well, last year there were 29,000. We're going to lose 4,060. And that's going to give us somewhere around the ballpark of 24,940 moose. So we're going to be somewhere around like 25,000 moose maybe. This isn't like a perfect example. Probably not super realistic to real life. I just made the numbers off the top of my head. But it just gives you an idea of more of a sort of more involved problem, I guess, to work through. Yes. And it's a good example of multiple choice questions, because if you did this calculation and you got this number, 4,060, and that was an option on a multiple choice test, you might be like, yep, 4,060, that's how many moose there will be in New Brunswick this year, which obviously is incorrect. But it's so easy to do that. I'm really bad for that. Give myself a little bump on the head. Yeah, I'm terrible for doing that. So just make sure you follow through and actually read what the question's asking. Okay, how many times have I said okay this evening? So moving on into next year. Next year, the moose population is reproducing at their physiological limit. So for whatever reason, the moose are reproducing like crazy this year. This is also known as blank growth. So when a population is reproducing at their physiological limit, so literally reproducing as much as they physically can. So let's say every cow moose in the province is pregnant this particular year. They're all bearing children. That is called exponential growth. If you look, at a population curve, it's going to be going like straight up. Because the next generation is going to have even more moose, and let's say they all reproduce like mad too, and it's just going to keep going up, 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 which is good in my opinion because I love them. Not great because they cause a lot of fatal motor vehicle accidents, but other than that, they're unproblematic. So this type of exponential growth is very much not sustainable. So I mean, like I just said, they cause a lot of motor vehicle accidents, so they're not good for people. In terms of when their numbers get too high, it's not necessarily a good thing. But just in general, if the moose population continued to grow like mad, it's like doubling every year, let's say, then eventually there's going to be so many moose that they're going to run out of resources. They're going to run out of ponds to chew grass out of. They're going to run out of, particularly in the winter, right, when there's a lot less access to food. They're going to run out of twigs to chew on. Some of them are, lack of resources. Unfortunately, they're going to not make it through the winter. So yeah, this isn't sustainable. So typically populations that are growing exponentially will convert to logistic growth as the population size approaches the maximum size that can be supported by available resources, which is otherwise known as the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is the limit, the maximum population of moose that the province can handle. And so eventually exponential growth is going to stop. It's going to convert to logistic growth, which is a bit more reasonable. Now, this isn't perfect. Typically, there's going to be some overshoot. So they're probably going to continue to exponentially grow above that carrying capacity. And then, a bunch of them will unfortunately, starve to death, lack of resources. What can you do? Population will start to go down and it'll sort of oscillate around that carrying capacity. Yes, okay. Last thing, although moose are quite plentiful in New Brunswick, they are, I love that for them. There are only about 1,000 of these creatures on mainland Nova Scotia. This is true, I actually looked up the numbers. I think there's about 5,000 in Cape Breton, but on the mainland of Nova Scotia, there's only about 1,000 of them, which is like not very many to me. We have so many. But anyway, not very many. So unfortunately, the tick population was very hard on the Nova Scotian population this winter. This is fake news, I just made it up. And this number has dwindled down to only 100 animals. Sad face, that is indeed sad. Again, I just made that up. There was not a mass fatality of moose in Nova Scotia that I know of this winter. But for the sake of this session, what effect is this reduced small population now susceptible to, and what could be the consequence? So this small population, ooh, there's no room. That's a pet peeve of mine. I'm gonna see where we can cut corners. There we go. So the small population is now susceptible to the Ali effect, which essentially just says if the population is too small, which is hard to define, too small, reproduction will be reduced. There's a lot of different reasons why that could happen. Probably inbreeding is a big one, right? Like if the population gets too small, then you're going to have a certain degree of relatedness within the population, and that's not necessarily a great thing in terms of, fitness. But yeah, there's no really, one straightforward, strict reason why the Ali effect might occur in a small population. But it's really, quite unfortunate because in the dwindling population, you don't want reproduction to be reduced. So unfortunately, this could lead to extinction. Probably not, really extinction of moose because they're, like I said, very, very plentiful in New Brunswick, very obviously very plentiful in Newfoundland over on the Rock. But this sort of group of mainland Nova Scotia moose could become extinct. That's actually called extirpation, when they're extirpated from one certain spot. But anyway, extinction of the moose population on the mainland, which is also known as extirpation. Yeah, I mean, there are no moose on PEI, for example, but I guess, it's difficult because Nova Scotia shares a land border with New Brunswick, so will they ever, completely go extinct? Probably not on the mainland, unless there's something major that happens. Because Newfoundland showed us they can reproduce like crazy because the entire population of moose over in Newfoundland came from a small handful of moose from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and now they are out of control. I've actually never been to Newfoundland, so I really can't speak on that, but I know lots of people that have spent time over there, and everyone tells me, with my love for moose, that I must go to Newfoundland and see the moose. It's on my bucket list. Definitely one of the provinces I'd love to see most. Anyway, aside from my travel plans for the future, are there any questions? We do have a few minutes to sort of go over if there are any concerns. If not, you